Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 51. Talking with Music. Weiss took a deep breath as she stood in front of the white door. She was a little unsure about what she was about to do, as while her relationship with Whitley was better than it had been in years, they were still not especially close. The boy was still very guarded around pretty much everyone, and it seemed very much like his snarky attitude was something that would not be changing any time soon. But it was enough for Weiss to know that the boy was not completely lost, that their father had not completely corrupted him in the time she'd left him alone. In her hand was her laptop and a couple of files for work, though those things had been with her every waking moment for the past 3 days. There was less than 24 hours until the gala and her meeting with Ironwood, and while she thought, or more accurately hoped, that she was ready, more preparation never hurt. Unfortunately for her, she was unable to study in a room at that current time, and while she could have chosen any room in the house, she did want to see how her brother was doing since they hadn't really talked for over a week. So after another deep breath, she raised her hand and tapped on the door to her brother's room. She heard nothing. After 20 seconds, she tapped on the door again, and once again received no reply. She knew he was in there, so for a third time, she reached out to knock a little harder, and heard a groan come from behind it. A couple of seconds later, it was thrown open, and Whitley stood before her wearing a white shirt and dark blue pants. His white hair was a little unkempt, but she knew it was likely because he was relaxing. "What do you want, sister?" he asked impatiently, as his hand brushed a strand of hair from his eyes. "The cleaners are doing the room next to mine," she said politely, and held up her work. "It's making it rather difficult to focus. I was hoping I could sit in here with you for a while, just until they're done. This house has 56 other rooms you could use." His tone was full of suspicion as he scowled at her. "Why do you want to come into mine?" Her eyes locked onto the blue eyes of her brother, and she let a kind smile pull at her face. "I also thought we could catch up while I work. I've been so busy lately that we haven't had time. I do not need you to try and reassure me that you are around." "I know," she said with a nod. The boy had been the same the last time she had approached him after the meeting with their father, but she knew he would let her in eventually. "I just want to spend some time with my brother for a will." Ping. The loud sound of a scroll receiving a message cut her off, and Whitley looked over his shoulder to the glowing device that sat on his bed next to some textbooks. He seemed contemplative for a second, like he was unsure as to what to do, but after a minute he closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. With a small step to the side, he held out his arm to motion towards the desk. "Fine," he breathed as she walked past. "But I am working too." "Understood," she said with a smile and placed her laptop and files on the desk. As Weiss organized her stuff, she watched her brother out of the corner of her eye. Despite his claim of working, the first thing he went for when he returned to his bed was his scroll. His fingers nimbly typed out a message, but she noticed that his thumb hovered for a split second over the send button before pressing it. She recognized the action, as she herself had done it months prior when she first began to text Young, and deduced that whoever he was talking to was still a rather new acquaintance. She looked away from him, as he had chosen to glance over at her, and pulled her laptop open. She typed in the password as she sat down, and spread out a few of the paper she was working on. They were full of numbers and ideas she likely wouldn't need, but it was better to know Dr. Polendina's thoughts than not know them. They also served as a good excuse to take sneak peeks at her brother as she referenced them. The fact that his papers were even on his bed was something she took note of. Though she hadn't really taken much notice of him in the past, she'd always just assumed that he was like her and the rest of the family and preferred to study at his desk. However, from the way he slumped into a seemingly familiar position, that clearly wasn't the case. She racked her brain for any other time she'd seen her brother be so informal in his presentation, and couldn't remember any, other than when his hand was hurting. He was always proper, always neat, but then again, she had never bothered to see him behind closed doors. She knew that her surprise at his more relaxed nature was entirely her own fault. It still pained her that she had let him feel that way, even unknowingly. Their relationship may have been mistrustful, but she had never actually hated him. Though she had avoided him for fear of believing he was turning into her father, she had thought those things with a heavy heart. Again, that was her fault, and she couldn't change any of what she had done. She could never take back that fact that she had made him feel alone, but what she could do was make sure that he knew that was no longer the case. So as she opened a new document on her laptop, she let out a small cough and tried for a little casual conversation. "So?" she said hesitantly while keeping her eyes on her laptop so that he didn't feel like she was expecting anything. "Your retake was yesterday?" Just as she suspected, she received no reply. Weiss knew Whitley only talked on his own terms, and she didn't want to pressure him, so she let the silence hang there. The tapping of keys filled the air, and Weiss fell back into her work. However, just as she thought he wouldn't answer, she heard him speak. "It was." Her head almost turned to face him, but she stopped it and continued her work. "And how did it go?" "Full." Ping. Marks. "It's far easier to write when your main hand can actually hold a pen." "I would assume so," Weiss hummed. She was happy that her brother's hand had fully healed. Just as Yang said, it only took just over a week before the boy's hand had finally healed, and all that remained was a scar across one of his knuckles. Unfortunately, with their fair skin, it stuck out rather prominently. "Were my notes helpful at least?" she asked. "Very," he sighed, clearly bored of the conversation already. "Far more than the book Klein suggested to me. Though I suspect that was his intention." "Suspect?" Weiss smiled since she knew that it was absolutely Klein's intention to give him a useless book. "I thought you knew everyone's motive." Ping. "That ties in this house?" "Klein is difficult to read." Whitley sighed, the fact that he couldn't accurately guess someone's intentions clearly something that caused him annoyance. "You, on the other hand, are not, sister." Weiss turned to look at her brother and gave him a confused look. She wasn't quite sure what he was getting at, but his suspicious blue eyes were on her. "What have you been doing around father's office?" Weiss was silent for a moment. Of course, the boy was still using the staff to inform himself, and though she had tried, she couldn't figure out which ones reported to him. But he was right. She had been snooping around her father's office for a few days ever since she figured out a plan for the information Seal had found. However, the plan was exceptionally risky, and she needed to have solid evidence before she went ahead. Unfortunately, she had been unable to find anything since the man's computer was locked. "You know what I was doing there," she replied cautiously. "Tried to find something that could help me and Yang. I highly doubt father has an answer to your specific dilemma in his drawer, sister," he said with an arrogant raise of an eyebrow. "You know I could help. All that is needed is for you to ask." "You said you won't help me." "With your girlfriend." He shrugged as his scroll went off again, and his hand quickly flew to reply. "But I suspect what you are attempting in there is more about the company than anything to do with your surreptitious relationship." While he appeared to be more engrossed in replying to whoever messaged him, Weiss could tell that she had the majority of his attention. The issue was that she didn't quite trust the boy just yet. She was working on it, and it wasn't affecting her promise of trying to be there for him, but the fact that he was still a loose cannon that was serving his own goals gave her pause to actually go into detail with him. Nevertheless, he did know a lot, and that knowledge could certainly be useful. So she took a breath that caught his attention and looked him square in the eyes as she spoke. Yang was very much right when she said it felt like he could see inside of her. "I need access to father's computer, but it's locked." "Why?" "I have my reasons." "That you can't trust me with?" "Correct." A small grin pulled at her brother's features as his eyes bore into hers. "I don't suppose you know the password, do you?" "Unfortunately." Whitley breathed and returned to his work. Clearly, he had been seeking the answer to something himself and seemed to have found it. "I have yet to figure out what the password is either." Despite having known it was a long shot, Weiss couldn't help but be a little disappointed at her brother's answer. If there was anyone who knew it, then it would be him, but since he didn't, she was back to square one. So with a sigh, she turned back to her work and pulled open her email to see one from Auburn Fletch. She quickly opened it to see yet another dismissive message from him, just as she expected, though they had become less so lately since she had dropped the businesswoman approach as much as she could. As she was replying to the email, she heard Whitley's scroll ring again. "You sure get a lot of messages. Anyone interesting?" she asked before she could stop herself, though she was sure she knew who it was already. "Just an acquaintance," he said, his tone just as dismissive as the email she was replying to. "I don't suppose this acquaintance happens to live on a farm?" "That is none of your business, sister." His voice had hardened immediately, and Weiss knew not to push further. Even though they were in a better place, she still wasn't close enough to play the teasing sister like Yang could with Ruby. So giving a nod that she was certain he saw, she returned to her email and let the boy keep his friendship with Oscar to himself. The gentle sound of music flowed around the room and filled Weiss's ears as her fingers danced across the piano. It was her final practice before her performance the next day, and she finally felt comfortable with playing the piece she had chosen. It was a nice and gentle piece that spoke of love and peace, a piece she knew would go over well at a gala held at a museum full of art that was beloved for its beauty. The only issue was that she was struggling a little with the final stretch. It wasn't that she was tired, because she wasn't, nor that the piece was too difficult, though it was rather complex, but that something just felt off. She wasn't sure what it was, but as she neared the end, the passion seemed to fade from the notes. They felt empty and hollow, like they were played for the sake of being played. But she needed to play, she needed to make sure that the piece was perfect, so she had been pushing past the frustration to make it so. However, as her ears picked up a particularly dull note, she couldn't put it aside any longer, and let out a loud groan as her hands dropped from the keys. "Your heart is fading, daughter." The voice caught Weiss off guard as she hadn't even heard the door open, but she looked to her side and saw her mother standing in the open doorway. She'd been looking very good lately. Her clothes were neater, the white shirt and light purple jacket staying free, and her hair was brushed into a neat ponytail that hung over one shoulder. Her posture seemed better too, and her blue eyes shone brighter. Despite that though, Weiss couldn't help but tense at the sight of the glass in her mother's hand, a glass that was filled halfway with clear liquid. Her tenseness didn't stop, however, as the woman showed just how perceptive she was by following her gaze down to the glass. She tilted it from side to side, the liquid sloshing audibly. "It's just water," she said carefully, still not having taken a step into the room. Weiss gave the woman a small nod. "What do you mean my heart is fading?" The woman still didn't move, so Weiss turned her head back to the piano, making sure that the gesture for her to enter was clear enough. It took a couple of seconds, but heels finally clicked against the floor tiles as her mother made her way towards the piano stool. "It has been so lovely to hear you play these past weeks," the woman said slowly as she sat down and cradled the water in her hands. "Your music has held so much love." Her head dropped slightly to look at her drink. "A love I feared you had lost. But I do not hear that in your playing as of late. It feels hollow and obligatory. That is not how this piece is supposed to be played." She looked at her mother and registered everything she had just said. She'd been listening? For how long? And even drunk, she had been able to tell just how happy she was while playing. But she was right, that feeling was missing in her playing, and even she had noted it herself. "That's because it is being played out of obligation," she sighed and folded her hands in her lap. "I would rather not be playing tomorrow." "I can tell," Willow remarked and reached up to place the drink on top of the instrument. "But you should always play with your heart, Weiss. Is music anything more than noise if there is no feeling?" "I suppose that is true," Weiss replied and gazed at the keys. "But how do I add feeling to something I don't want to play?" The soft hum was contemplative, and to Weiss' surprise, her mother raised a hand to the keys and effortlessly played a delicate tune. It was the first she'd heard her mother play in almost a decade, and the notes and memories caused Weiss to close her eyes in an attempt to cherish them just a little longer. "I would say..." The sound of her playing stopped, and a heavy breath left the older woman. "Stop trying to play for the crowd. Play for the person who has shown such sunlight on your life." Weiss' eyes snapped open as she turned to her mother, and worry pulsed through her at the very specific words the woman had chosen. She had been listening to her music, but had she still been able to understand it while drunk? It certainly seemed so. And Yang had mentioned that she believed the woman had not had a drink in almost a month. Weiss knew she had definitely played while thinking of her girlfriend in that time, and had the woman been listening while sober, there was no doubt in her mind that she would have heard that. "I'm not asking you to tell me." Willow interrupted her attempt to lie and reached for her drink again. "I don't think I even have the right to ask. But whoever it is clearly makes you extremely happy. Your music speaks of joy and delight, of mindless days spent enjoying the embrace of someone who loves you back. Do not exclude them from your music, especially not from this piece." Weiss looked at her mother with wondrous eyes as she described the music she'd heard, but quickly let them fall back to her hands. "But how can I play in such a way in front of Father? Would he not hear it? Your father. Her voice cut out, and Weiss glanced to see a darkness in the older Shani's icy blue eyes. Does not hear music. He does not have such a capacity. He hears noise that pleases him, sounds that are either played in the proper order or are not. He cares not for what those notes are saying. Weiss mulled over those words, and found they actually made a lot of sense. Her father barely cared about his art, using it only to show off his wealth. That certainly does sound like father, Weiss agreed. So forget about him, and play for yourself. Weiss let out a loud sigh and gave her mother a nod. She closed her eyes and raised a hand to the keys, gently pressing down and hearing the notes around her. She let the memory of the recent date spring to the front of her mind, and found her fingers effortlessly playing out the song. A small smile pulled at her face as she opened her eyes and let it trail off. She turned to see her mother smiling too. Thank you, Mom. You needn't thank me, Weiss, Willow replied sadly, her smile faltering as she stared down at her feet. This lesson was long past due. Her thumb stroked the side of the glass that was cradled in her hands, and a look of remorse flickered over her blue eyes. I'm sorry for not being around. Weiss had dreamed about the day her mother sorted herself out, about the days she would finally get the mother she had lost when she was 10 years old back, and every time she imagined it, that apology had been present. It always felt like what people should do, admitting their faults and asking for forgiveness. But after hearing it, after seeing the regret in her mother's eyes, Weiss realized just how childish that notion was. Her mother had nothing to apologize for. She was a victim of the same man that made the lives of every relative she loved miserable. Her actions, though still her own, were only to relieve herself of the horrors that came with living with such a man. So with a caring smile, Weiss rested her hand on her mother's shoulder and gently shook her head. There is nothing you need to apologize to me for, she said softly, hoping that the older woman could hear the assurance. I don't blame you. You should. Her mother's voice caught on her words, and a tear dropped into her lap as her voice turned into a whisper. I left you. All of you. IP promised to keep you safe from him, and I failed. The things you have fared, they are all my fault. They are no more your fault than they're mine, Weiss said firmly, as one of her mother's hands came up to hide her face, the action not making the sight any less painful. Which is none. The blame there lies with father, and him alone. But I did nothing that you cannot change. Weiss breathed and slipped the hand that was resting on her mother's shoulder around to hug her. I was hurt when you shut us out, but I now understand what happened. And I forgive you. Willow's hand dropped from her face to reveal trails of tears down her pale cheeks. Are really? Yes, Weiss replied with a warm smile. Okay, The woman sniffled and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket as she took a moment to find her voice. But I promise. Those days are over. I'm glad to hear that. Weiss thought about what she was about to say and finally let out a low breath. However, it isn't me who needs to hear that. It's Whitley. Willow's face dropped again at the mention of her son's name. Shame filled her already sad eyes, and her eyes dropped to the keys while a finger raised to nervously stroke one. While she wasn't crying anymore, the sight made Weiss' heart hurt even more, as it was clearly a look of self-loathing. And when she spoke, Weiss had never heard a more ashamed voice in her life. Her whisper of a voice cracked as her finger pushed down on the key to produce a sound that was so full of pain, a sound that Weiss wished to never hear again. I don't know how. My darling boy, and I don't even know him. It's not too late, Mom. Weiss tried to reassure the older woman, only to receive a shake of her head in return. He doesn't even know me as his mother. I'm just the drunk he sees around the house. What could I even say to make up for that? Her voice fell to an almost inaudible whisper, and her head hung low. He wouldn't even care. I think, Weiss said slowly, and placed a hand on her mother's, that Whitley might just surprise you. He's rough, and certainly has some issues that I don't think will change, but he is far more receptive than he lets on. She let her hand slide off Willow's to glide along the keys, her fingers playing a gentle melody as they went. I cannot say it will be easy, nor that it won't take some time, but if you reach out to him and try to mend those fences, I do believe he will listen. But where do I begin? She mumbled. And do I even deserve to be a part of his life? Weiss let out a deep sigh as she continued playing keys at random to produce a careful melody as she thought. She couldn't imagine how her mother could be feeling at that moment. The knowledge that she'd let her son grow up without her, or even worse, that she had been someone that he grew to hate, must have been hurting her immeasurably. But the only thing Weiss could do was keep playing. Minutes passed, and she heard a few sniffles from the older woman, and once it was clear she had calmed down, Weiss gave her a kind smile. "Start by showing him that you care," she said slowly. "I think that is what he cares about the most, that we are actually there for him, because he feels alone. Take it slow though, he doesn't like being pushed. Just let him know that he can come to you. That's how I started with him. You didn't hurt him like I did." "No, I hurt him worse," Weiss countered. "It is true that all he knows of you is a drunk, but now you can break that image and replace it with a better one. I broke his original image of me and turned it into something ugly. Now I have to rebuild it. You may even have an easier time than I will." Another minute passed with nothing said, and Weiss saw her mother watching her fingers flit across keys. Her eyes were deep in thought, but she finally let out a sad sigh. "Do you really think I can reach him?" "I do." Weiss kept her answer short, and once again, Willow fell silent to think. With the song she was playing coming to an end, Weiss slowed her pace until it was done and let her hands fall away. Her mother still hadn't spoken, but instead sat stroking the glass in her hand. She realized that the woman clearly needed some time to think, so gently rose from the stool to leave and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder for a moment as she passed. However, as she neared the door and began to pull it open, she heard her mother's voice again, though the sadness had been replaced with fear. The sound caused a pulse of worry to run through her. "You are preparing to fight him," the woman said. "Aren't you?" Weiss halted with her hand on the doorknob. Though it was posed as a question, the knowing tone that crept into the scared voice let her know it wasn't. She turned around and saw the blue eyes boring into hers, and unable to lie, Weiss gave a small nod. "I am," she said firmly in the hope that the certainty in her own voice would reassure her mother. "I won't let him continue as he has been any more." "That is a dangerous war you are waging, daughter," Willow replied, and a pleading look entered her eyes. "I won't ask you not to fight it, but I know more than most what that vile man is capable of. So please be careful." "I will," Weiss replied and went to make her way out of the room, only to stop when an idea came to mind. It was as much a long shot as it was with Whitley, but she turned back to face her. "Mom, do you know the password to Father's computer?" Willow looked at her suspiciously for a couple of seconds. She kept eye contact and waited patiently, but could stop her hope from growing. If her mother didn't know the password, surely she would have said so straight away. The longer it took, Weiss wondered if the woman was contemplating the ramifications of aiding her in the war that was about to take place. But thankfully, after almost a minute, the woman let out a deep breath and nodded. 11th of May, 1993, she said sadly. The date clearly caused her pain. "The day he first met my father." Weiss let a smile pull at her lips. Finally, she had almost everything she needed to enact her plan. "Thank you," she whispered. However, the fear in her mother's eyes was still very much there, so she let her smile drop and put on a serious look as she addressed her. "Mom, can I ask you to do something for me? I believe, with everything I haven't done, it would be wrong for me to say no to whatever you ask, Weiss." "Okay." Weiss took in a deep breath to prepare for what she was about to ask. "When you have fixed things with Whitley, I want you to take him away from this house." Willow seemed taken aback at first, as if what Weiss had just suggested was the most terrifying thing imaginable. That feeling was confirmed when she spoke, the shakiness returning to her voice. "But that would mean." She stood up as the realization hit her. "Weiss, I will not leave you alone with that monster again." She gave her mother a confident look and straightened her back. "I'm not scared of him anymore, Mom." She lied, but did everything she could to keep her from seeing the truth. "But you and Whitley, you've faced enough. I don't want you caught in the crossfire for what I am about to do." Before her mother could reply, Weiss turned around and opened the door. "I can't force you to, but please, save yourselves from this." Without another word, she left the room behind. She hated the fact that she had just told her mother to leave, but she hoped the woman would. She would get the last piece of information that would confirm her suspicions tomorrow, and if they were confirmed then, the fallout of what she was going to do would be huge. She doubted her mother could mend fences with her son in a couple of days, but she wanted her family around as little as possible for what was to come. So with a heavy sigh to herself, she pulled out her scroll and made a note of the password to her father's computer. If she got the confirmation she needed, she could start her plan while Jacques was busy at the party. Chapter 52. Seeking a Promise. The sounds of ringing filled Weiss's left ear as she held her scroll to it. Behind her was the sound of 100 people talking and mingling, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional bark of laughter. Weiss didn't have a single care about what was happening in the room behind her, though. The party may have been in full swing, but she was about to perform, and to do that, she needed a certain someone to drag her out of her sour mood that was produced by almost 2 hours spent standing next to her father discussing business. Just hearing him talk about her company had made her skin crawl. "Come on, come on!" she muttered impatiently to herself in the little alcove she found off to the side of the main room. She only had a couple of minutes. She shifted from one foot to the other as she waited. In truth, she was a little nervous and really hoped Jan would pick up. The scroll rang a few more times, and just as she started to think she would have to go on without talking to her girlfriend, the call was answered, though the voice that picked up wasn't what she was expecting. "Hey, Snow Queen," a male voice said breathlessly, like they had been running. But there was a hint of humor to his gentle tone. "What? Fucker!" There was a loud crash on the other end of the line, following what she knew to be Yang's voice, that made Weiss pull the device away from her ear. After what sounded like some scuffling and some laughter in the background, Yang's deep breaths rang clear as day. "Hey, beautiful." "Yang? What was that crash?" she asked, a little worried. "Just the Nana breath meeting his old friend, the wall," Yang panted, clearly taking a moment to get her breath back. "What's up?" "Oh," Weiss breathed a sigh of relief, putting together the pieces and realizing why Yang had taken so long to answer. "I'm just about to go on. I wanted to call you first." "Crap, didn't realize it was that time already. 1 second. The sound of a door closing quietened the laughter. "You nervous?" She sat down on a nearby chair and let out a soft sigh as she nodded, but quickly realized Yang couldn't see that. "A little?" she breathed. "I'm sure you will do great. You sounded amazing the other day." Remembering the piano session where Yang had been listening from a previous call, she felt a smile force its way onto her face. But that wasn't the part she was actually worried about. "It's less the recital and more the other thing," Weiss replied quietly and fiddled with her off-center ponytail to make sure it was positioned correctly. "If I don't get this promise of future funding, I lose my project." "You've been studying this for 2 weeks," Yang chuckled on the other end of the call. "And you're probably the smartest person I know. You have this in the bag. But what if I screw up? I'm sure Ironwood won't care too much," Yang said in a reassuring voice. "Plus, isn't he a family friend? Winter said he accepted her into the military at your mom's request." "I know, but I don't want his funding for anything more than the merit of my project." Weiss sighed and straightened out her white dress. She knew her mother could easily put in a good word like she did with Winter, but that was not how she wanted to conduct business just yet. In the future, it would likely become inevitable that some partnerships and investments were made on the basis of trust and friendship. Her grandfather had done as much after all, but she wanted her current project to all be through confidence that they would succeed. Even if it was only to prove to herself that she didn't need to know the right people to succeed. "And you will, so just relax a little. Last time you were too tense, you made no progress with that Fletch guy." "You're right," Weiss said, and took a deep breath, slowly letting it out and feeling her nerves quell a little. "Kind of hard to not be nervous, though." Yang said dismissively, the sound of springs in the background from what Weiss assumed was a bed. A bed she wished she had been occupying for the last couple of nights. "Nerves are good. It shows you care. I guess." "Good. So what are you gonna do when you get the promise?" When?" Weiss felt her smile widen at the certainty of her girlfriend's voice and continued. "I get the deal. I might take a few of my vacation days." Gonna whisk me away somewhere exotic, are you?" "One day," she laughed. "But no. I was thinking that I could say I'm going on a spa retreat, but maybe spend the weekend at the apartment instead." "Are you asking me for permission?" Yang asked in amusement. "Because you ain't gonna hear me say no to that." I know, Weiss replied and stood up. I just wanted to check you weren't busy. Never too busy for you, gorgeous. Good. Weiss grinned and pulled the scroll away from her ear to check the time to see she was to play in less than 2 minutes. But I have to go. I'm about to play. Break a leg, beautiful. Love you. Love you too. As she heard the sound of a kiss being blown, Weiss hung up the phone with a wide smile on her face. Yang never failed to put her nerves at ease, so, feeling emboldened by the brief conversation, she took a deep breath and made her way back to the crowded room. With the conversation fresh in her mind, and the incentive to spend a weekend with Yang, she didn't doubt that she could give the audience quite a show. The sound of music that had been filling the giant room for the last 5 minutes slowly began to die down, the remnants of her last notes slowly fading out. It had gone better than she expected, a few missed notes for sure, but after almost 5 years without playing, and only the few sparse sessions since regaining her passion, it certainly could have been worse. Thankfully, the song had felt right, and the entire time she played, she'd held Yang in the forefront of her mind, and felt her in every note she produced. As those sunny notes finally dissipated, it was replaced by a slow, harsh clapping. As more people joined in, and the sound grew in volume, Weiss stood from her stool and turned to face the audience. They all seemed to be smiling and happy, so Weiss took it as a good sign and gave them all a little curtsy. She felt oddly happy that people had enjoyed her performance so much, but not wanting to revel in the applause too much, she gave the guests a small wave and made her way back towards the crowd. As she weaved her way back through the crowd, she received praise and congratulations from the guests, and happily replied by saying it was simply her pleasure to play. That was a lie, of course, since while she had enjoyed it, she would have preferred to have been able to focus exclusively on the meeting. But nonetheless, she smiled and waved until she reached her father. He was already deep in conversation with an older man who had his silver hair tied back in a ponytail. Deep lines were etched on his face, and his body was rather slim. However, the man was clearly in great shape since he didn't require a walking stick or any assistance, and was moving around quite animatedly. Weiss knew he was a shareholder by the name of Edward Caspin. In fact, he was one of the oldest shareholders, and was a friend of her grandfather's before he had passed. As she approached, they both turned to her and smiled, and the difference was night and day. Edward's was warm and friendly, inspiring comfort and a genuine feeling like he was happy to see her. Her father's, on the other hand, was clearly fake. It was cold and practiced, nothing more than a show for those around him. "Welcome back, daughter," he said politely, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Hello, father. Edward. It's good to see you again, Weiss," the man replied, his voice filled with actual warmth as he held out his hand. She shook it happily. "Your playing was beautiful. Right, Shock?" "A few missed notes," the elder she remarked offhandedly, though Weiss knew it was only supposed to appear that way. "But yes, even without playing for years, she shows skill befitting a Schnee." "Oh, come now, Jacques," Edward said with a chuckle. "It would hardly kill you to compliment your daughter on her talents." "Thank you, Edward." Weiss chuckled at the man's jab, but quickly let the humor fade and replaced it with a respect that made her stomach churn. "But my father is right, there were some off notes. I will be more practiced next time." "Then I expect an invite." "Naturally," she smiled. "Forgive me, but I don't suppose you have seen General Ironwood around?" "Ha ha, eager to work on the man, huh?" Edward laughed heartily. "With your drive, I suspect you will have that promise in record time. But alas, I believe he is taking a call right now, so why don't you join us for a little talk to satiate your business appetite? Your father was just telling me about his upcoming trip to Mistral in 2 weeks to check on our offices overseas." Weiss looked towards the doors to a side room and saw a female at Legion Guard standing next to it. The white and blue uniform accentuated her brown skin, and the sides of her hair were shaved short, the middle left slightly longer, and 2 tufts of white standing out at the front. Though she looked rather relaxed as she leaned against the wall, her purple eyes scanned the room, keenly alert for any dangers the room may hold. It was very clear she wouldn't be getting through to see the general anytime soon, so she turned back to Edward with a smile and gave a nod. "Great," the man said happily. "Please continue, Jacques." "Well, as I was saying, productivity of the mines has been down lately," he said dryly, returning to his usual business voice. "Talks of strikes and unfair wages. Preposterous ramblings, of course. We pay them all the same. Ah, that we do, Caspian hummed. But given the recent dip in Mistral's economy, it's hardly surprising that the people are worried. Surely you can see their side of the argument. What I see is my employees complaining about things that we had no part in, instead of their own government. Jacques replied coldly, though the older man seemed unfazed. Why should we be paying more because their kingdom is unable to keep its finances in order? Not untrue, though a little heartless, Edward said before he turned in her direction. What are your thoughts, Weiss? I don't think this is my call to make. Oh, come now. You are the heiress, destined to take over one day. I would love to hear your opinion of this situation. Well, Weiss hummed thoughtfully, not daring to look her father in the eye. They are our employees, and while it is true that we aren't obligated to raise their wages, they would hardly be productive if they are homeless and hungry. So you think their wages should be raised? I think everyone should be able to afford the necessities. Weiss corrected him, feeling her father's eyes bore into the side of her head. A roof over their head, food in their fridge. The basics. It isn't, however, our place to pay for the unnecessary. I agree. And where do both of you propose this money come from? Jacques said tiredly. We are the world's most profitable company, Weiss retorted, earning a nod of confirmation from Edward. I'm sure we could afford to raise our wages to suit a certain standard of living. Unless all those controversies have affected our stocks more than I'm aware of? Weiss couldn't help but take the small jab, which caused her father to immediately glare at her in response. The controversies had certainly affected the company, but it was still more than capable of increasing wages a little. So to hear her father try and use the excuse about how it wasn't the company's job to make sure their employees' personal lives were stable, at the very least, when in reality he simply wanted to save money, rubbed her the wrong way. Fortunately not. Though there have been a few too many, Edward said pointedly. I also don't believe we are in such a position where we cannot be open to discussing their wages. Perhaps this is something that we should discuss further. Before your trip. Fine, but I still do not see how this is our issue. You never do, Weiss thought to herself. Thankfully, Edward seemed to be on her side as well. Weiss was happy that at least a few of her grandfather's friends were still involved in the company. Unfortunately, there really were only a few. I know you don't, but it is something the board should discuss, he said, and Weiss detected a little edge to his voice. Have you considered joining him for this trip, Weiss? I'm not sure what use I would be if father is already there, Weiss replied with a forced chuckle. I'm sure there is a lot that a bright young woman such as yourself could do. I couldn't agree more, Ed. Weiss turned to see who had spoken and was surprised to see Ironwood was standing right behind her. She hadn't seen a picture of him in some time, so she was surprised that he looked so tired. Though still kind, his blue eyes had started to betray his age, as did the wrinkles around them. A black beard covered his face, only having received the barest trimming to at least straighten it out, and his hair was very much in the same disheveled state. Though, in stark contrast, his clothes were pristine. The blue shirt and red tie stood out vibrantly underneath the white vest. Over all of them he wore a long white coat, with pressed blue pants and black boots. On his hip, just peeking out from the open coat, was a holster, in which a pair of guns sat either side of his hip. The look exuded an aura of authority that put any thought of the man being past his prime to bed, as there was no doubt the man before her was still a force to be reckoned with. The thing that surprised her most, however, was that she caught a familiar face in the corner of her eye, and turned to see her sister standing behind the general. She was dressed in more formal attire, but it was still quite militaristic. A white collared shirt was beneath her white coat with pale blue embroidery on the shoulders, and around her neck was a silver brooch with a ruby in its center that Weiss knew once belonged to their grandmother. Just like her boss, blue pants and boots completed her look. But as she gazed into her sister's eyes, one of the woman's eyebrows raised in disapproval, and she immediately returned her gaze to General Ironwood. Such kind words, General Ironwood, she replied with a smile, happy that he had at least sought her out first. You're a family friend, call me James, he replied with a smile that made him look younger by a considerable amount. It's good to see you again, James, Edward said with a smile, the two men shaking hands. You're looking old, my friend. You still have me beat on the silver hair, though, Ed. Ironwood chuckled as stroked his own gray patch and turned to look at the other white-haired man. Jacques, he said in a dull voice. James! Everyone knew that the two men didn't exactly get along. In fact, if it weren't for the fact they had to do business together, Weiss doubted if they would ever talk. However, Jock's eyes roamed over to Winter. And my 9-year-old daughter has come home. Again. I would say hello, but I'm busy doing my job. Winter scowled in return. Thank Winter! Ironwood cut her off sternly, and the woman immediately fell silent. It was odd for Weiss to see the woman that she had always seen as the epitome of disobedience fall in line so quickly. No arguments today, please. My apologies, sir. Ironwood let out a low sigh that really did betray just how tired he was. But after running a hand over his face, he looked back up with a smile. Anyway, I cannot stay long. There is business back in Atlas that I must attend to. What a shame, Jock replied, and though he was trying to appear genuine, the sarcasm was obvious. Quite, Weiss added, purposely letting her smile falter. I was hoping I could talk to you. Mother recently divulged a few stories of her college days, and I would love to hear more from an old school friend. Out the corner of her eyes, she saw the almost imperceptible shaking of Winter's head, but Ironwood simply smiled. Well, I do have another 40 minutes before I leave, and I am always happy to talk about Willow, though this place is a little too loud for any real discussion. Would you care to accompany me on a stroll around Beacon's campus? I would be more than happy to join you, Weiss said with a happy smile and turned back to Caspin. I'm sorry to leave you so soon, Edward. Oh, please, I know the allure of learning a parent's secrets, though you should always be careful with what private things you find out. Not all are pleasant, he said with a wink, though Weiss was certain she saw his eye dart to Jacques first. But please give some thought to my suggestion of you visiting Mistral. There was an insistence in his voice that made it clear he wanted her to go. Edward was a good man, and she knew he was on board with giving the Mistral workers their wage increase, so was he hoping she could do something to convince her father? That certainly wasn't going to happen since it was clear the man's mind was already made up. However, a sudden surge of inspiration came to her, and if she timed it right, she could certainly find a way to make everyone but her father happy. And that was something Weiss was always willing to do. So as she walked to Ironwood's side, she nodded to the shareholder and received a delighted smile in return before returning to his conversation with her father. She looked up at the general, as he was quite a tall man, too, as he mimicked the same smile down at her, and turned to address Winter, as well as the dark-skinned woman that stood beside her. Winter! Harriet! You may stay here. Are you sure, sir? I hardly doubt your sister is going to try and assassinate me. He chuckled. Take a break and say hello to your brother. He looks bored. Weiss looked over at Whitley to see that he did indeed look quite bored as he absent-mindedly inspected a painting. And make sure Harriet doesn't spill anything. I can't promise anything. Hey, the girl said, the insult in her voice obvious. Is that any way to talk about your best friend? Vine isn't here. Whatever. I bet I can go all night without spilling anything. You know what? Winter said with a raised eyebrow as she turned to the other woman, who seemed more alive. As your competitive nature will likely mean less babysitting for me, I will take that bet. Yes, well, enjoy yourselves, Ironwood replied with a shake of his head, the action telling Weiss that the interaction that had just happened wasn't too far out of the norm. Shall we go, Weiss? She gave a small nod and Ironwood set off at a slow pace towards the door, Weiss quickly falling into step with him. As they made their way towards the entrance, a few more people waved hello to her, and she politely waved back, as did General Ironwood. At one point, a faunus waiter tried to offer them a beverage, but they both turned it away. But finally, they reached the entrance and James pushed the twin doors open to reveal the darkening sky. The smell of seawater and the roar of the nearby waterfall reached her immediately once they stepped out, a stark difference to the smell of mingled perfume and food from inside the museum. If she was honest, she liked it more. So as Ironwood stepped leisurely down the steps, Weiss was happy to see he make a beeline for the low wall that stopped people from falling off the cliff and into the ocean. So how much did your mother tell you of our college days? He said in interest once they reached the wall, the beautiful view of Vale still visible in what little light remained. She told me you were close friends, Weiss replied with a smile. So much so that she squared things away with the dean when you were caught sneaking beer onto the campus. Ah yes, our rebel days. He chuckled fondly. I remember the parties well, though with quite a bit of embarrassment too. It's hard to imagine you were ever a party boy, nor that my mother was. We were not always so old. He grinned, causing a little of the youth he was remembering to return to his face. It was good to get away from the stress of Atlas Academy on occasion. The level of education is great, but the rules are a little stifling. Part of the reason I decided on Beacon. Plus, it's a lot smaller, so I doubt I would get stuck if I decided to climb it. Weiss chuckled as Ironwood's eyes widened slightly. How does someone get stuck on the side of a building? Your mother really told you that? He replied with a bark of laughter. The sound's quite pleasant. I suppose she neglected to tell you that it was her challenge that led to that predicament. Weiss gave the man a surprised look. She didn't mention that, no. Well, it was, Ironwood said, the laughter fading and a more gentle fondness overtaking his face. Your mother was an exceptional woman. Smart, beautiful, driven, and a more fierce friend I have never known, but she was also quite mischievous in her youth. You remind me of her quite a bit, though she had less of a penchant for lying. Weiss looked up at him as they circled the campus, the few students that were running the risk of breaking curfew to spend a couple of extra minutes outside glancing curiously towards them. There was a knowing look in the man's eyes as his smile widened. She knew the game was up, and let out a sigh at the fact that she hadn't been able to convince him for very long. Who told you? Your father usually only invites me to these things when he wishes to discuss business, Ironwood said, though there was no loss of warmth from his tone. But he has barely even acknowledged me. You, on the other hand. My apologies, James, Weiss said sincerely, letting her head return to watch where they were walking. I shouldn't have misled you. You are hardly the first. He shook his head in amusement and came to a stop. His hands came to a rest on the wall, and Weiss heard a distinctive metal clink as he set the left one down. I assume you want to talk about that chip of yours? I must admit that the project does intrigue me. It really is a great project, Weiss replied, ditching the pretense and stopping beside him, resting on her elbows as she leant onto the wall too. One I really want to succeed. And I want it to succeed too, Ironwood said in a measured tone as his eyes scanned Vale's skyline. I have known many proud soldiers who had to be discharged due to nerve damage, despite still having plenty of fight left in them. But I am sure you understand why I am hesitant to back a project with no real results. A project that my own advisors say will not work. Your advisors are clearly underestimating Dr. Polendina, Weiss replied. Maybe. But your concerns are valid. Research has only just begun, and we are years away from any kind of trials. I can't promise you anything if you invest now. Not a very compelling argument there, Weiss. Ironwood chuckled and shook his head. Yes. Well, I don't intend to be like my father, making up whatever false promises I have to so that I can get your money. And I appreciate that, but I am afraid that even your honesty cannot get me to offer you funding today. I know, that is why I'm not seeking it. Weiss let out a deep breath. That is why I wish to make you an offer. Weiss kept her focus on the city, but she knew Ironwood had turned to look at her. She had never fooled herself into thinking that she could convince the general of anything, because as it was very true that they had nothing to really bargain. Even as she looked over everything that had been compiled so far, she hadn't seen anything that gave an absolute that the project would work. All she had so far was the confidence of Dr. Polendina's belief that it would be scientifically possible, and a hope that it would succeed. But that was all she needed. Polendina was a genius and understood the body better than anyone else on Remnant. If he said it was possible, then just like her grandfather would have, she was willing to take that risk. You have me intrigued, Ironwood said slowly, his gaze returning to the water, and his eyes following a boat that was skimming across the water. What kind of offer? An extra 10%, she stated simply. I don't expect you to invest today, but I do want to go back into that museum with a promise that, if we can show you definitive results in the next 2 years, you will offer us funding. In return, I am willing to shave another 10% off your purchase price when the chip is ready, totally 40%. You won't find a better rate than that. Surely those are your father's decisions to make. What assurance do I have that you will uphold your end of the bargain? Weiss stayed silent for a moment, not sure exactly how much she wanted to divulge. But he was right. Though it was her project, The board had final sign-off on the pricing of all development, and she didn't know any other way to convince him but to tell him the truth. So taking a deep breath, she looked ahead and let confidence overcome her features, as she knew he was likely inspecting her for any fault. "Father will not be making any decisions very soon," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "His time as CEO of the STC is coming to an end. I will be seeing to that personally." Ironwood hummed thoughtfully, his hand curling into a fist. "I guess your sister was being honest about your coup then." Weiss couldn't stop her mask from slipping as she turned to him in surprise, but he merely chuckled in return. "Yes," she told me. "And for what it's worth, I am in full support." "You are?" Weiss asked, expecting Ironwood to be a little more put off by the idea of what was basically insubordination. Something shifted in the man's blue eyes, a darkness that made him look far older. It tainted the rest of his features, and sent a shiver of fear through Weiss as she immediately recognized it as hate. "That man is a foul human being." His tone was dark and foreboding. "I warned your mother the first time I met him, but she didn't listen. She was blinded by his silver tongue, and now all I see are the scars of everything he has done. Your mother, a brilliant woman, defeated and crushed. Your sister, haunted and scarred far more than she lets on. Even the fondness of Mantle, emboldened by the White Fang due to his treatment of him. I would not cry a single tear should he be stripped of every bit of lien he owns and thrown to the streets. Which is why I want him out." Weiss agreed with a nod. "He has done far too much damage to everyone with my grandfather's company. I wish to take it in a new direction. One that is better for everyone on Remnant. Where we don't just make televisions and scrolls, but change the very existence of people for the better. This project is my first step to that goal. And as much as I admire that goal, it does not change that you have no proof of concept for me," Ironwood said with a heavy sigh. "Then it is good that I am asking for nothing more than a promise that will only come into effect if I can provide you some down the line." Another silence fell over them, and Weiss let it continue as she knew the man was thinking the proposal over. As she waited, she looked toward the twin towers in the distance, where she knew Yang as likely hoping that she succeeded. She wanted to make it happen so that she could make their relationship public sooner too, but even if it didn't, there were other things in the works that would guarantee that happened anyway. "Perhaps if you move the Proj." "I can't." Weiss cut him off. She knew what his demand would be, but she had already set her terms. It was time to take control of the conversation. "We could offer you more than the RMRF if you did." "You could, but not more than both you and them combined," she said firmly. "I do not want this to be a military product, James. I want this in the hands of everyone who needs it, and to do that I need it to be as cheap as I can possibly make it for people. Funding from both of you is what I need for that to happen, and I will lose the RMRF completely if this project is moved to Atlas." Ironwood let out another sigh and stood up straight. From his desire to have the project moved, she knew she had him, but she had to hold firm in her offer. Thankfully, a second sigh soon followed, a more resigned one that confirmed the battle was hers. 45. He said, his own voice as firm as hers, as he turned towards her, and his blue eyes looked into her own. Weiss turned to him and thought about it for a second. She could compromise a little. 42. Final offer, James. A small smirk pulled at the older man's lips, and after a second, he held out his hand with a nod. "I can do that." Joy exploded inside Weiss, and a smile broke out on her face, but she kept it under control. With an enormous amount of effort, she suppressed her shaking and reached out to shake his hand. "If you are able to show me results in the next 2 years, then I promise that you will have the funding of the Atlesian military. But my promise is with you, and you alone." "Understood, General. In return, the Schnee-Tech company will give the Atlas military and all personnel a 42% investor's discount when the project is complete." "Good," the man said with a happy smile. "I really do hope that your project succeeds, Weiss. I doubt you would waste your time with such a promise if you didn't have faith." "You are right there." He chuckled and stepped away from the wall. "I learned at a young age never to underestimate a Schnee's determination, and I have yet to ever be proven wrong." "Good," she mimicked with a smirk as they both set off as a slow pace towards the museum again. Weiss was glad for the short silence that overcame them as they walked, since it allowed her to process what had just happened. She had received the promise. she was keeping her project. Should they produce results, then she was one step closer to making her mark on the world. But the thing that was most important to her at the very moment was that she was one step closer to being able to reveal her relationship with Young. With Ironwood's promise being tied to her directly, her removal from the company meant the promise went with it. It was a form of leverage that her father couldn't deny, and one that she doubted he would risk as it wouldn't be available again for some time. And though it wasn't enough to secure her position just yet, it was certainly a good thing to have in her corner. However, there was still more to her plan, and still more that she needed from the general himself. "There is something else I would like to ask you, if you don't mind?" She broke the silence cautiously, and James looked towards her with interest. "Not another project you want me to invest in, I hope?" he asked in return, and gave a short chuckle when she shook her head. "Then feel free." "Well, with your recent enforcement of new laws in Atlas, I believe I would be correct in assuming you work closely with the council?" "I do. And I take it from your hesitance to call my actions what they are that you don't agree with them." "I don't, BU." "It's fine, Weiss." Ironwood sighed heavily. "I am used to my decisions being questioned, and people are right to do so. I don't like the registry either, but it is saving lives." Weiss stopped and placed a hand on the man's arm to get his attention. "That is not my question, James." She corrected him with a look into his eyes. It was clear from the sadness behind them that his words were genuine, and that the lengths he was going to weigh heavily on him too. "I understand you have your reasons for doing what you must, even if I don't agree with how you're doing them. Hopefully my company can help lessen that burden in the future." "I hope so too," he said quietly, but shook his head and looked up. "So what is it you wanted to ask me?" "Well, since you work closely with the council," Weiss elaborated as they began to walk again, "I was wondering if you could give me some information on a couple of people? So long as it isn't confidential, I don't think that will be an issue." "What are their names?" "Carmine Esclados and Bertilac Celadone." It was subtle, but Weiss saw his eyes dart suspiciously to her. Clearly the names were familiar to him. "Those are two rather specific names," he remarked, confirming her suspicions. "I take that to mean that you know them?" "Unfortunately," James replied, her gaze returning to the path ahead of him. "They were inspectors for the council, but both were let go after allegations that they took money to falsify a report. There was never any proof, but the building burned down a week after they passed it. I'm guessing that this is something to do with your coup?" "Yes. And you just helped immensely," Weiss confirmed, feeling no need to hide it from him. He had just given her all the confirmation she needed that her father had been engaged in bribery, and because of that, she was finally ready to put her plan into action. "Would it be possible for you to send those files to me?" "They are unreleased as of right now," Ironwood hummed. "But considering the cause, I'm sure I can get them to you." "Thank you." "Is that all?" he chuckled, clearly knowing it wasn't. "Almost." They came to a stop at the door of the museum, the thick wood keeping a majority of the noise out. Weiss didn't want to go back inside, but she knew she had to. She had to keep up appearances, right up until the very end. "I need a way out of this party. A way that doesn't make people suspicious. Namely my father." He raised a hand and stroked his chin as he thought for a second, but the idea visibly formed behind his eyes, and he gave a short nod. "I can organize that. I will give you 10 minutes. "Thank you, James," she breathed, glad to have a military general on her side. "For everything." "It's no problem. Our goals align after all." Weiss placed her hand on the door and prepared to pull it open, but before she did, she looked back at the older man with an understanding smile. "By the way, my mother isn't crushed. She has been working hard lately to fight off what my father has done. But I am sure she could use a friend again, so maybe you should call her." His eyes seemed happy at her words, and he gave a short, understanding nod. With that, Weiss smiled and pulled the door open, walking back into the loud party to once again be met with the smell of perfume and food. Walking back through the crowd, she spotted her father talking to yet another shareholder a small distance away, and as their eyes made contact, she gave him a subtle nod to show that she had succeeded in her task. She also held back bile as she stared into the cold eyes of the man. His face was impassive at first, but a greedy grin broke out on his face as he turned back to the other woman. Since she didn't want to face him, She made her way over to one of the new paintings that hung on the walls and inspected it, as she did with the next as well, and the next, all while counting the minutes in her head. Ironwood said he would have her out in 10 minutes, and given his line of work, she knew that would be exactly when it happened. However, just as she counted the third minute in her head, the tall form of her sister sidled up beside her. "It appears you won the general over," she stated simply, her eyes roaming over the art too. "MHM." Weiss hummed, suspicious about what Winter was doing as she realized that Ironwood hadn't actually filled her in on the plan. "I'm just happy it went well," she said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "Yes, well, I did say that General Ironwood was excited to meet you." The woman chuckled as they moved to the next painting. "So how is the apartment serving you?" "It's okay," Weiss replied, still taking a little while to adjust. I can understand why." Winter placed her hands behind her back, and a softer tone entered her voice. "I hope it works out. I will also be signing it over to you tomorrow before I leave, after all." What? Weiss couldn't help but be shocked at those words. She knew her sister hated the apartment, that the use of it had been very sparse in general, but for it to be given away like it meant nothing was a bit of a surprise. "I don't use it, and I never intend to," Winter explained carefully. "You have found more use in it during the last 2 weeks than I have in years, and quite honestly, I'm tired of paying for water and power that I do not use. So you either accept, or I sell it once you are done with it." Are you sure?" Winter gave a short nod and came to a stop against an empty space of the wall. After a second of thought on how good it would be to actually own her own place for when everything went down, Weiss finally gave a short nod. "Fine, but I want to at least give you half the value back." "I am assuming you won't take no for an answer?" Weiss shook her head, and Winter gave her a smirk. "Very well. Though I now don't feel quite as bad for this." "Huh?" For WH. Before Weiss could even finish her sentence, a small yelp of surprise came from behind her, followed by a loud clanging of metal on wood. She didn't even have time to turn around when a flood of tepid liquid splashed against her back and over her shoulder. In less than a second, her white dress was stained red from the wine, and from the wet sensation on her head, she knew it was in her hair as well. She quickly spun around to find the culprit, and was greeted by Ironwood's other guard, Harriet, holding up a faunus waiter and apologizing profusely. "Harriet!" Winter half shouted as she took a step forward, all eyes in the room on them. "How many times must we tell you to be careful?" "I'm sorry," the girl said frantically, though Weiss could see her eyes were just as alive as when she had accepted the challenge earlier and realization dawned on her. "Ironwood sent me to get you, and he was in a hurry, and I didn't see the why." She cut off her rambling, and her eyes darted to Weiss to scan her up and down. "Shit! It went all over you." "That is not an apology," Winter almost bellowed, the people nearby shrinking back slightly as Winter stood up to her full height. Harriet looked between the two and quickly stood up straight herself, though her smaller frame was nowhere near as intimidating as Winter's. "You're right. Weiss, I sincerely apologize for my clumsiness." Weiss looked at her, unsure what to do for a second. She knew it was just a ploy, and that she herself had requested it, but being covered in liquid that was turning sticky rather quickly, and making the fabric of her dress uncomfortable would make anyone a little grumpy. Despite that though, she didn't want to be too harsh. "Yes," she sighed, as she shook her hand free of the wine that was dripping down it. "Accidents happen. Though I expect you will take responsibility for the cleaning bill?" "Of course," Harriet replied immediately. "Just be grateful that my sis—" "That's enough." Ironwood's voice wasn't raised, nor was it aggressive, but there was something to it that sent a shiver of worry down Weiss' soaked back. Though she knew it was fake, that didn't change how steeped in authority his voice was, and even had the other two girls next to her not been in on the plan, Weiss doubted they would act any different. The argument stopped instantly, and they both snapped to attention as he approached. "You?" He motioned to the waiter, who was trying to quietly clean up as much of the red wine as he could. "Leave it. Bring Harriet a mop, and she will clean up her own mess." The man stood up with a nod and James' attention turned to Winter. "What did I say about causing a scene today, Schnee?" "Do not make one, sir." "My apologies, General Ironwood." His eyes bored into Winter's for a moment, but Weiss was close enough that she saw the corner of his lips twitch. Finally, though, he let out a sigh and turned to look at her instead. "I apologize for my operative's clumsiness, Miss Schnee." "It's fine, James," Weiss replied with a shake of her head. "I think I should head home and shower, though." "Of course. Would you like my driver to take you?" "No, thank you. I have my own." Weiss smiled as she shook off another bead of wine. "You could tell my father that I must go, though, if you don't mind." "It's the least I can do." With a small nod of gratitude to the man, which she hoped he understood, Weiss walked past him to the door, very aware that all eyes were on her. As she approached them, she signaled for one of the greeters to fetch her bag, and it only took him a couple seconds to disappear into the side room and reappear with her clutch. Taking it from him with her non-wine-soaked hand, she slung it over her shoulder and pulled out her scroll and sent a message to Hazel, who she had ordered to wait nearby, and pushed the doors open. The wind had grown a little stronger in the few minutes she had been inside, though that could have been due to the liquid on her skin that was slowly getting colder. And as she waited for Hazel to arrive, she couldn't help but wish Ironwood had chosen a more comfortable way to free her from the party. Weiss was greeted by the empty atrium of Schnee Manor, the cold wind outside incomparable to the chilled air of the mansion. With the tiled floor and walls, and metal armor that stood on the sides, it wasn't hard to imagine why it was perpetually cold. She knew it would be empty, of course, as she'd called Klein ahead of her arrival to make sure of it. However, not wanting to be seen, she closed the door and made her way straight for her father's office. It was less than a minute until she pushed her way into the even colder office, and not wasting a single moment, she moved along to the home computer, not daring to sit down for fear of leaving a stain. Her scroll was opened and she typed in the password her mother had told her, and Weiss let out a breath of relief as she finally got past the locked screen she had been stumped at all week. Happiness rushed through her, and she brought up all the other names and dates she had stored on a document on her personal device, and quickly began to search through the computer. It took almost half an hour. Half an hour of trying numerous things such as the name of the inspectors, the name of the mine they had examined. Half an hour of finding nothing. But then it hit her. She had tried a date, the date of the inspection, and a file came up. But that wasn't the only one. For more dates of other inspections that she had noted down brought up a file each, all of them zipped and locked with a passcode. Thankfully, the man was arrogant enough that he'd used the same code as his login, and Weiss quickly read through what was in the files. There wasn't as much as she'd hoped for, but each one caused her grin to widen significantly, and as she copied them over to her scroll, she couldn't help but vocalize her happiness. "Got you, you bastard," she muttered to herself.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.